Our reading this morning is words from James Baldwin that were published in Nobody Knows My Name, More Notes of a Native Son, that came out in 1961. It's been adapted for inclusive gender language. In this passage, Baldwin is writing about white U.S. Americans. He writes, "Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or dreamed one possessed. Yet it is only when a person is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream they have long cherished or a privilege they have long possessed, that they are set free. They have set themselves free for higher dreams, for greater privileges." Here ends our reading. Years ago, when I was living in DC, I went to the Holocaust Museum. How many folks here have been to that museum? So you know that part of its genius is the brilliant way in which the very design of the museum makes many of its points. I'll give you just one example of that. In one room, there were exhibits that were encased in 3 or 4 foot high walls, like turrets in a castle. As I recall, the exhibits inside were ones that included things so disturbing that on the surface of it, the walls were there to prevent small children from seeing inside without their guardians or parents choosing to let them see and helping them to see. But I'm pretty sure the walls were also a metaphor. Inside them, there was footage of what life inside the ghettos was like, where Jews were walled off and herded and kept in substandard conditions. Inside was a description of Joseph Mengelé's infamous experiments on twins at Auschwitz, and images, as I recall, of what Germans made from the bodies of Jews, the skin lampshades. All of it was a reminder of what was, in fact, going on inside, just inside the walls of the ghettos or of the camps. Not simple to see, but not entirely hidden either. Things that people in Europe and around the world had to look intentionally to see. The walls around these exhibits then were a reminder, it seemed to me, of the moral requirement to look. For much of American history, the abuse and cruelty of whites against blacks in particular, though inflicted on other peoples of color too, it wasn't something anyone had to look hard to see. The evils of slavery, the debasement of segregation, public lynchings, many on courthouse lawns, were public and unabashed. But then things got a little more covert. A social security system that rescued the white poor and elderly, but compromised to get the law passed by being willing to exempt those jobs largely held by blacks, leaving black Americans behind in what is arguably the largest anti-poverty measure in American history. Or the redlining that Sam mentioned, that denied blacks the greatest wealth accumulation tool, savings tool that most Americans have at their disposal, the purchase of a home with loans and tax write-offs that are like an informal savings plan, tax incentives and breaks, arguably a welfare for the haves. There is new Jim Crow, of course, that creates a criminal justice system that targets and profits from the disproportionate incarceration of black men. Maybe this isn't so much about looking over walls, not that hard to see, but certainly about looking through veils, I'd say, of policies whose justifications pretend on the surface to be neutral, but to look a little harder, just a little, to see what biases undergird our systems, our laws, and our privileges, and what power structures and protections they reinforce, and for whom. We all know now that race as such is a construct, was a construct. I was listening recently to a program, the program Seen on Radio, S-C-E-N-E, Seen on Radio. It's hosted and produced by John Baldwin. He did a 14-part documentary series in 2017 called Seeing White, in which he invited leaders and scholars and regular guest, Dr. Chenjerai Kumanyika. And the two would engage in looking through history at the construct of whiteness and the reality of its lived effects. The concept of whiteness, this racialized understanding of the world, they remind their listeners, it's not innate. The Greeks, for example, apparently didn't have a notion of race and race hierarchies. For sure, you might not be surprised, the Greeks had notions of inferiority and superiority, for sure. But that is to say that everyone from the Ethiopians to the Slavs, the latter, by the way, a people who were so often enslaved through history that their name is where the word slave came from, that all of those peoples were inferior to the Greeks, but not based on skin color. According to historian Ibram Kendi, one of the guests on the show, racial constructs, particularly this black-white construct, shows up in the mid-1400s and shows up in the work of a Portuguese biographer, Gomes de Zurara. Zurara is hired by the King of Portugal to write a biography of the king's uncle, known as Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry, who is the first major slave trader to exclusively enslave people from Africa. Zurara chronicles Henry's historic first journey to sub-Saharan Africa. And in that chronicling, he uses the biography to justify this slave trade just begun. In his account, we see, for the first time, the historian argues, various peoples who are gathered as slaves from many different communities, all lumped into one category that is based on skin color alone. And justification for their enslavement is now framed as a Christian calling, a life in which captivity abroad is better than freedom at home, where people lived, Zurara said, like beasts. And so the racial construct of race, of being a color only, and inferior always, is born. Zurara's book and this idea would spread like a virus across Europe. It would frame the enslavement of Africans by other European communities. It would frame an understanding and justification for colonialism. It would make its way with European conquerors to America and shape this land's unfolding too. And growing up, not surprisingly, right alongside this racialized notion of blackness was a fleshed out, if you will excuse the term, a fleshed out notion of what whiteness entailed. A notion of who was white that, as you know from American history, it gets broadened, right? Italians aren't considered white in the beginning. There's much to this. A notion of who was white, what whiteness justified, what it entitled one to, legally, socially, morally. And over time, those constructs, of course, affected the way histories were told and laws got written and the norms of behavior that were set, and how inherited loss or gain was carried forward and amplified until we had a system of white supremacy, which is to say, a racialized construct of whiteness built on the idea of white supremacy, reinforced in custom and tradition and law and lived experience until it is perpetuated seamlessly by society, a world carefully, thoroughly thought through, in which this deformation is the norm. Of course, the truth is a system like this is never seamlessly carried out. The truth is that there is an experienced tearing at the seams every moment that it's lived, tearing at the lives of those whose worth and dignity, whose protections and rights are on the losing side of the system, which is to say non-white folks. To people of color, the culture of whiteness, which with its privileges and its inequities is inescapable in its ravages. But as a white person, we, white folk, can refuse to see it, and often do and have. Why is it harder to see for white folk? Robin DiAngelo, I think, gives us one clue in her book, White Fragility. She points out that in 2016 to 17, not only were the 10 richest Americans white, but 93% of the people who decided what TV programs Americans watched were white. 90% of those who decided what books got published were white. And even 82% of teachers were white. There are more stats, but those are good enough for you to get the idea. Think about what that means, right, in terms of power and momentum to perpetuate a flawed system of ideology and culture. I mean, let's be clear. If Unitarian Universalists were 90% of those in charge of TV and books and teachers and leaders in Congress, let's throw that one in, how much would be different? At least I'd like to think so. Our perspective, right, would inform norms and laws and conversations and how stories were told and what history got written. And the same is true if that were Latinx people doing all the deciding, or Asian Americans, or Pacific Islanders, or African Americans. Who tells the story? Who decides the laws and the cultural reference points? Think how much TV your average American watches. Who does all that? Who frames the norms? Well, they frame the norm. When 90% of those writing laws are white, what do we think that means? Whiteness is in charge. And so for white people, it can look like our experienced norm is the norm, because it is. But it's a chosen norm with inherited flaws, and we can see from the effects on non-white folk, even just who's left out of all those stats, alone says a story of de facto racism and its results, can see that it's a norm that needs to be, as Sam mentioned, undone, broadened, in which whiteness gets decentered. Now, like Sam, I feel hugely unqualified to know some or all of what that means to do that work. I mean, suburban New Jersey is wonderful, but it's probably not, the cutting edge. So I knew when I came to San Francisco that we would have to learn and teach one another how to do this work. And I assumed you knew that would be true for me. And we are, I think, stepping into that work a lot. About 30 of us last month read and discussed white fragility. The white folks adding a second session because the conversation was so rich and felt hugely unfinished. So we're going to offer, just so you know, another chance for people who didn't get the opportunity to join those conversations to at least join another conversation this month. And if people of color want another space again to meet for separate reflection, for healing around some of the effects of white defensiveness and gaslighting around race issues, we'll make that space available too. And next month, 30 of our lay leaders are going to participate with 30 lay leaders from Oakland, from the UU congregation there, in a training on what it might mean to start to dismantle white supremacy. But the training videos from that, done by an amazing consultant out of the Twin Cities, who is supported largely by Unitarian Universalists. Those training videos, we're going to have 3 separate opportunities for people to come to church and watch them with us and be part of the discussion so we can all begin to immerse ourselves in this. And even the consultant that we hired for the mission vision, we went back to the drawing board at the last minute to find someone who could bring tools about what it meant to decenter whiteness and pay attention to that in our mission vision work. And we've got a fantastic person as our partner now in that. And none of this that we're doing together, none of it is about getting it right, or about shaming or blaming or catching people out. We don't need that energy slowing us down, because what it's about is trying to see this thing that is whiteness and all the levers that support and promote white supremacy, things that need to be named and then undone and then remade in new form. It's work that I am learning can be as simple as paying attention to who you mean when you say we, and making sure it includes people of color when it should. And it means making sure that the faces and voices represented on Sunday morning's worship, which today is pretty white on the face of it, so to speak, but maybe woven into the voices, that's something we pay attention to. It will mean perhaps learning to be honest about American history in lots of ways, realizing, for instance, as Robin DiAngelo points out, that there are no, quote, good old days of American history for Black Americans. That instead, maybe those good old days, if we white Americans do our work, are a promise yet to come. And it might include facing the larger, tougher questions of what righting historic wrongs will look like and what sacrifices it might ask of the white folks, the ones who reaped the benefits, large and small, for so long, and do still. As Baldwin said, any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end to safety. And at such a moment, unable to see or daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or dreamed one possessed. Yet it is only when a person is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream they have long cherished or a privilege they have long possessed, that they are set free, that they have set themselves free for higher dreams and greater privileges. We were all not as carefully taught, I am sure, as we would have liked. No one completely escapes the ignorance of their times. But for white folk, the price of that has been complicity in a system of oppression and lies that started way back in 1400 and carries through to today. And we have an obligation here, especially, and a legacy here that calls us to be dismantlers of that system. I'll end with this. Imagine you are in California gold country with your family shortly after you've moved to this city. It's a weekend when there's a heat wave, heat of the levels people told you did not happen in California, though surely they were lying to get you to move here. But that isn't the only surprise of the weekend. At one point, you stand in front of a display of covered wagons, one of which, the big one, says it was made by the most successful wagon maker in the county, a black man. And at a blacksmith shop, the docent says that this shop and all the shops and buildings on the street were owned by a free black family, one of the most successful in town. And looking at the dates of when these people lived, you realize that all this prosperity and flourishing happened in California at a time when other blacks around the country had almost no hope of freedom, let alone prosperity and power. And then you remember that the trail to their success begins here, with our king, Thomas Starr King, and a congregation that saw through the veil of ignorance and evil that was the notion of whiteness in its lived reality at that time, and who fought to stop it in its tracks. And then you realize that this place you have come to is one that always has to ask what it means to carry that legacy forward for the next part of the journey. And for us, seeing whiteness, dismantling the foundations of white supremacy, it has to be part of the work of our age. Because as James Baldwin also said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced, until it is seen. Bless us in the unfolding of our part in the larger story of liberation and love. Amen.